welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. Today's episode is going to be different to my usual style. Normally what I do is I do all of my research during the week and I write up a script, and then I kind of stick to the script about 85% of the time. About 15% of the time, I'm just saying whatever pops into my head as I'm reading the script. But this week, I decided not to write a script. I do have some bullet points that I'm going to be referring to be able to keep me on track. But I wanted to sort of spend my time being a little bit more organic about the way that I'm expressing the things that I've discovered during the week. Because I'm, from practice, but also just because I think it's a lot more conducive to having a really good quality radio show, something that you never know what's going to happen. So be mindful that there might be some dog barking in the background. I have put my phone on airplane mode because it has a tendency to ding and ring while I'm recording all day long, but it won't do that today. And I also just wanted to just feel the concept of doing things this way, because this is the way I'd like to go in the future. And I'm also hoping to be able to start doing this show live as well, because now that we've changed times, it's easier for me to be available at the times that the show is going to be airing. So bear with me if I make a few mistakes. I'm going to be quite new at this, and I'm just going to do my best. And I expect that every week we'll get a bit better and better. So this show is called Human Ascension with Ellie for a reason. And that's because we talk about the concept of raising our consciousness and moving forward into a new kind of humanity, a new type of reality. And one of the things that becomes obvious when you start talking about raising your consciousness and your level of awareness and moving from 3D to 5D or from three-dimensional reality to a five-dimensional reality is that there are certain types of characteristics as a person that you would have to begin to embody in order to become lighter and more spiritually aware. And one of those characteristics is that of being virtuous. And to be virtuous, we have to kind of understand what that means. Well, what is virtuosity and how does it relate to human ascension? And are there any virtual people who actually you see, this is what happens. And are there any virtuous people who actually exist today? I know we hear about virtuous people from the past, but sometimes I think that, a lot has probably been forgotten about the fact that they're real people and they have good and bad attributes, and they probably have flaws that don't transcend time and don't make it into the history books and things like that. And so the best way to think about virtuosity is to look at people from the current time and find out whether there are any actual virtuous people who do exist. So the first thing we should do is we should take a look at this word virtuous or virtuosity so that we know what it is that we're actually looking for. And I've checked some dictionary translations here. The sources that I'm using are the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is the primary dictionary for the United States. Also the Collins English Dictionary, which the US and the UK both tend to share, and the Cambridge Dictionary, which is primarily used in the UK. And they all boil down to having the same types of definitions. Back in the day, so, hundreds of years ago, to be virtuous was applied differently to men and women. For men, it had a certain level of definitions, which now basically have stretched over to cover women as well. But women were expected to be virgins in order to be virtuous. So they had to be a virgin first and then everything else second. That has become a very old-fashioned kind of view, maybe not for everyone, but for most of the world. And so it's considered to be an archaic definition for virtuosity. That's what's generally written in the dictionaries. They say archaic. The current definition or set of definitions for virtuosity are ethical, moral, and righteous. So demonstrating ethics, morality, and righteousness. So those are the definitions. Why is it necessary to understand that? And why is virtuosity necessary in order for humans to ascend? That was my next question. And it turns out that the reason for that is to be able to add to the spiritual growth of a person and their enlightenment and their ability to raise their consciousness. It aligns them with higher principles of love, which consist of, or higher principles which consist of love and compassion, humility and integrity. It helps them to overcome negative traits such as anger or greed or selfishness. And it leads to an inner transformation of that person, because if they are overcoming their negativity and letting go of things like self-absorbed selfishness and greed and hunger for money and material possessions, or anger where they actually have grievances against lots of other people, then, or other situations, then it leaves the door open for so many other positive things to enter into that empty space. And those positive things are the love and the compassion and the humility and the integrity towards other people and in certain circumstances. Virtuosity also transforms a person into being softer. And that softness are the positive attributes that are taking over from the negative ones that have been expelled. But also it allows them to spend less time worrying about themselves and more time having a greater awareness of everything else that exists in the world. And that's where the humility and the compassion come from. They get to recognize the humanity in other people, or the vulnerability of the earth and the reason why you need to treat it fairly, or the vulnerability and innocence of animals and things like that. And it helps to raise their awareness of that. It also allows them to create greater harmony and balance, not only when it comes to the outside world. So, for example, harmony and balance in the environment or across nations, lessening wars and things like that, but bringing it closer to home and creating more harmony and balance with relationships, whether it be with family or friends or a partner or even just neighbors, and having this, or their society, their community and things like that. But also creating harmony and balance within themselves. So there's a greater sense of inner peace as well, and a harmonious aspect of their character begins to form. So they may sleep better, they may feel better, they may make better choices in life, and they may have a sense of inner calm as well. So virtuosity actually plays a much bigger part in a person's life when it comes to their within, and also their immediate relationships, and also their place in the wider world. But it also allows for greater consciousness by allowing them to be more open, allowing them to be more lighter in their essence, which then allows them to kind of elevate to a higher sort of level of consciousness in some way, or a higher degree of awareness with the world. There are some who believe that being virtuous is the test for humanity, and that it is actually humanity's divine purpose. That's the reason why we're placed on this earth. And if that's the case, if the whole point of us and our earthly experience is to learn to be virtuous, that immediately begins to explain the reason why living on earth can sometimes be so challenging, because it is challenging for the purposes of teaching us to be virtuous against the odds. Now, isn't that an interesting concept? When I read this, I thought to myself, it actually makes a lot of sense. It seems a bit mean or cruel to put a spirit or an ego element into a situation that's deliberately going to be testing them day in and day out, to see whether or not they develop this virtuosity. But at the same time, if that's what part of the evolutionary process is, and if this is the only way to be able to evolve, then it makes sense that humanity would be placed somewhere to be able to go through the cycle of elevating itself through proving its virtuosity in situations that are giving a person a chance to actually be unvirtuous. So when you see, I remember when I was really young, one day I was sitting at the bus stop and there was an older lady, and this was probably in the late 70s or early 80s. There was an older lady sitting next to me, and she had put her handbag down on the seat that we were both sharing. It was like a bench seat. And I spotted it, and her purse kind of opened when she put the bag down, and I could actually see a couple of notes of money sitting in her purse. Now, she was fussing around with shopping bags and she wasn't looking. And that was an opportunity for me to take those notes, which I don't know, $5 notes, $100 notes, I don't know what they were. If she was an older lady waiting for the bus, they were probably $5 notes. But it doesn't matter. Either way, that was her money, and it could have been her pension for all I know. And it could have been all the money that she was going to be relying on for the week or the month. And I remember I was really young. I was probably 17, something like that. So I guess it was maybe even 16. It was around about 1980, maybe something like that. And I remember looking and thinking, gosh, that money is so easy to reach. I was too young and too shy to point out to her, you should keep your purse handy. But I also had enough character, thankfully, not to take the money. But for a moment, I was very conscious of how easy it would be to take the money. And that makes me question what was actually going through my mind. I just remember the flash as I was talking to you of thinking to myself, gee, that money is right on display. It'd be so easy to take it. And I was good enough a person not to take it, but I also probably wasn't good enough to not say to her, excuse me, but, your money's on display. You might want to. But then young people, we're shy. And so sometimes it's just that shyness. That could have been one of those lessons of life to test my virtue. And I do wonder, actually, now that I've mentioned it, just like there probably have been a million of other opportunities that we've each experienced that have been there to test our virtue. So virtue is a concept that appears in all of the religions and faiths that I'm aware of. They all include concepts of virtuosity. And just to name a few, Buddhism considers virtuosity or a virtuous kind of self to consist of compassion and mindfulness and wisdom. Hinduism relates virtue to truthfulness, being nonviolent, and also having self-discipline. And then Christianity thinks of virtue as something akin to love and faith and hope. Do you notice the difference between them? Christianity is talking about love and faith and hope. So the definition is love for who? Faith of what? And hope for what? It seems as though it's kind of God-focused or focused on the promise of something. Whereas Buddhism talks about compassion towards someone else and having wisdom by learning from your experiences, things like that, and being mindful of your surroundings so that you're not overly interfering with the world or stepping outside of this environment that we're placed into. And Hinduism also gives you this sense of responsibility to be truthful and to avoid violence and to demonstrate discipline. I noticed straight away that Christianity was a little bit different. It was a little bit more vague in a way. But then again, maybe it's vague because there are so many examples of it that appear in the Bible. And so that kind of help to clarify. So let's have a look at what the Bible says about virtue. So the word virtuous or virtue only appears twice in the Bible. And but there are, of course, other words that talk about that kind of concept. But where virtue appears, let's have a look here. Proverbs 31:10 says, "Who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life." Ruth 3:11 says, "And now, my daughters, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request. For all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." The Bible really only talks about virtue in terms of how it applies to women being virginal in their characteristics. And there's no mention whatsoever of virtue when it comes to men, nothing. There is, however, some talk in the Bible or some passages in the Bible that relate to character. And it does relate to men as well as women here as well. So Colossians 3:12, for example, says, it talks about the character of the new man. And it says, "Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful." So in Colossians 3:12, it's talking about being gentle and kind and having humility and meekness, and to be patient with your suffering, and also to be patient with other people and to forgive other people, even if there's been complaints in the past. Because forgiveness has been given to man with the sacrifice of Christ, and so it's leading by example, and then people should be following in the same path. And that's basically it. And if you follow in the path that Christ has done by sacrificing those little petty squabbles and actually showing tenderness and love for each other, then you're bonding yourself more closely to God. So that's basically what it states. The next one is Peter 1:5. And that one I found interesting because with this particular passage, the concept is that faith is not enough. In order to have virtue or character, there needs to be more. And this is what it says. "For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness, knowledge, and to knowledge, self-control, and to self-control, perseverance, and to perseverance, godliness, and to godliness, mutual affection, and to mutual affection, love." But that's Peter 1:5. What this passage is saying is that to have faith in God does not make you a good Christian alone. It doesn't work like that in isolation. And this is something that many Christians or people who claim to be good Christians appear to have forgotten. And that is that, or maybe they've conveniently overlooked it. And that is that to claim to be faithful to God, or to claim to believe in God and to have God in your heart, for example, doesn't actually demonstrate that you are a good Christian and that you are at one with God or have a closeness to God. You have to couple it with other things. You need to have goodness. You need to be pursuing knowledge. You need to have self-discipline and self-control. You need to persevere. And once you do that, you start getting closer to godliness, right? So you embrace that, which then shows you the art of mutual affection towards others, and then obviously love. And that's when you become at one with God. Isn't it funny how there are some people out there who believe that just having faith brings them closeness to God? Peter 1:5 demonstrates that's not the case. Okay, another one that I found was interesting was Philippians 4:8. And this is about focusing on good things. And it says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." How many preachers are speaking of positive, And how many of them are trying to instill a negative by claiming that there's persecutions taking place and you should be fearful of demonic forces and it's a fight against light and darkness and things like that? When Philippians 4:8 is clearly stating that a good Christian's character and what helps to make them virtuous in the eyes of God is a focus on the positive. Whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. I thought that was interesting too. That's why I love to look at the Bible, because I like to demonstrate where the Bible appears to be making sense about what it wants to achieve, and perhaps people have fallen away from that truth, and also look at the Bible in ways that it's been conveniently disregarded or reinterpreted in flawed ways to kind of take you down the garden path. But here the passages seem to be making very strong statements about how to be a virtuous person and how to have character. There's another one here, and it's Galatians 5:22. It's about the natural state of God's world. And it says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." So, what this passage is stating is that the natural state of the world that was created by God is one of love and joy and peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And so when there is a war, the war has no power over the natural state, because the natural state is goodness. And so what is the purpose of war, if not to try and undo the natural state? And what's the purpose of casting judgment against others, if not to undo the natural state of God? So every single time you hear someone talking about how, they should bomb the S out of a place in the name of God, what they're actually stating is that they want to do the opposite of the natural state that God has created. And when they make a statement about having judgment against a person who lives a certain kind of lifestyle, maybe it relates to, or is a certain kind of person, maybe it's about looking at women as being less than men, or treating animals harshly, or being racist, or having a negative judgment against people who are homosexual or transgender or something like that. The natural state of God's world is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. All of those other things that I just mentioned are not part of God's world. So who is the one that should be judged? And then I have one more here, and that's Titus 2:7. And this is about setting an example. And it says, "In everything, set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity and seriousness." So this is about not just having faith. You have to have the character virtues as well. But not only have them as in believe them, you have to embody them. So you can't just have faith. You have to demonstrate that you are of character. You have to set the example. How many people do you know out there who claim to be devout in their faith, but somehow forget to demonstrate or embody any of that goodness that comes, which is called character or virtue in the Bible? Isn't that funny? So all of the concepts of virtue, according to the Christian Bible, and I'm using the New King James Bible, and I go to BibleGateway.com in order to do my research. It all boils down to wisdom, courage, self-control, and fairness. That's what setting the example is all about. The other message that's clear here is that having faith is not enough. You need to also embody other characteristics that are good. And the natural state of God's world is one which is positive. And so when you act in ways that are contrary to that, you're demonstrating the opposite of virtue. There are four essential or cardinal virtues that form part of religious scripture in a way, and they're fundamental to moral and fulfilling life. The first, and actually the reason why I'm talking about these is they also appear in the Rider-Waite Tarot deck. And so those of you who are doing my Meat and Potatoes Tarot podcast learning, then this might sound familiar to you. On episode 1, I talk about the Fool's Journey, which is a big concept in tarot. And this is where the Fool, that is the 0 card in the major arcana of the Rider-Waite Tarot deck, takes a journey from birth to throughout the existence of life, and it's expressed through the language of tarot. And during his travels, he actually encounters lessons from 4 essential virtues of life, which actually mirror the cardinal virtues that appear in Catholic teachings, I think, that are fundamental aspects of life and human existence. The first one is fortitude, and this one is represented by the Strength card in tarot. It relates to courage and resilience and determination, confronting fear or uncertainty and adversity in good ways, in courageous ways, showing moral integrity and standing up for what's right. The reason why it's called a virtue is because you can't get someone else to do this for you. This is something you have to embody inside yourself in order to possess the virtue. And so that very first virtue is basically fortitude, but courage is a very commonly used word. You need to be courageous. And that courage relates to determination and integrity and all sorts of things, and having that courage to stand up for what's right. The second virtue is temperance. And this is aligned to the Temperance card in tarot. It's about self-control, moderation, the regulation of desires or appetites or emotions, balance and harmony, avoiding excess, proportionate behavior, and maintaining harmonious relationships. Temperance is about moderating yourself and making sure that you don't lash out, that you don't act too rashly, that you don't let your emotions control you, that you control your emotions. The third virtue is prudence, and this is demonstrated in the Hermit card in tarot. This is about learning from experience, gaining wisdom, having discernment, and possessing the virtues of reason and logic, and also understanding the difference between right and wrong. So the element of prudence is about having gained wisdom from your previous experiences. And then the final virtue, which of course, these are all virtues because you have to have them inside you. You can't borrow them, you can't buy them, someone can't do it on your behalf. This is something you have to do for yourself. So this fourth one is justice, and it's represented by the Justice card in tarot. It's about fairness, equity or equality, maintaining harmony in society through fairness, and also it bonds the other virtues together. So when you act with fairness, then you don't instantly think about yourself. You think about the best way to move forward to be able to keep the bonds strengthened. So I want to talk to you about a person and their experience and their behaviors. And this is a person from not that long ago. And her name is Catherine Gunn. Let me go through her story. And then we're going to talk about the two sides of the story, because Catherine found herself at odds with another group of people. And we're going to look and see who appeared to embody these 7 virtues for humanity. So the reason why I chose Catherine is because there's aspects of her life that are actually quite similar to my own life. And so I was able to kind of look behind the facade of reporting and documents and things and see a little bit more about how she may have been feeling at the time, because I've had quite a few similar experiences to her in my upbringing and also in my work life and things like that. And so it's just kind of, I found her to be really interesting for that reason. Now, Catherine was born in 1974 in England. Her parents are Paul and Jan Harwood. Her mother and her father, her brother and herself are all white British Christians. They were all white British Christians at the time that this happened. I can't speak for now. Her father, despite being a white British Christian, studied Chinese, and that presented lots of job opportunities for him and the family overseas. So at the age of 3, Catherine and her family moved to Taiwan in order for her father to actually work there. Now, Catherine then studied at the Morrison Academy, which is an international school in Taiwan. It's generally a school for the children of missionaries, and so it has a religious base. Catherine lived in Taiwan until she was 16 years old, and she grew up multilingual as a result of that. So she was able to speak multiple languages. She returned to 16 in order to do her A-levels, which is the kind of final aspect of high school that prepare you for university. She ended up going to a boarding school, living in a boarding school during that time. And so she had additional experiences in the boarding school. Later, she described herself or self-described herself as having been a third culture kid. Now, I'm also a third culture kid in a way, and that's because what third culture kid means is it's a child who's had experience or exposure to more than one ethnicity or way of life during their lifetime. So anyone who lives overseas for a significant period during their younger years will often develop a greater awareness of what it's like to be one of the other in a way. So they end up with more of a worldly perspective than someone who has kind of lived in a small community with the same routine and the same traditions every single day of their life. If you have, particularly when you're growing up, if you have lived in lots of different places or had close exposure to lots of different ethnicities and traditions and religions and ways of life, then you get to kind of absorb a little bit of everything, and it gives you a very broad perspective. And that's what being a third culture kid is basically all about. And some of them end up speaking multiple languages as a result of that as well. I'm afraid I'm not really good at languages, so I tried all kinds of learning, and I failed at learning French, German, Italian, and Greek. I failed at all of them. So anywho, so Catherine grew up as this third culture kid. She also studied Chinese and Japanese at Durham University once she had finished high school. And she, after university, she traveled to Japan, where she taught English for a while. What Catherine really wanted is she wanted to be a linguist, but she had some trouble finding work. Until one day she responded to a cryptic ad in the newspaper for someone who had more than one language under their belt, so someone who could speak multiple languages. Now, I know exactly what this cryptic ad in the paper is all about because I have nearly responded to one myself. I came very, very close. For those who know me, don't know me, I have a background working in policing in Britain. I worked in policing for over a decade, and I really, really enjoyed it, actually. I enjoy what I do now even more, but I did enjoy it. It was very, very challenging, very, very political. Gosh, very political. But I learned an awful lot. And I would, when I was going into London for meetings, because I had to travel all over Britain for my job, but when I'd go into London for meetings, I'd get the Metro newspaper and a nice big cup of coffee, and I'd sit there feeling like I'm part of society. And every now and then there'd be an ad in the paper that was kind of cryptic, and it would be for MI6 or MI5 or something like that, which are kind of the secret services. One of them is like the FBI, and the other one's a bit more like the CIA. And I knew that I would be qualified to apply for some of these jobs. They were advertising for, I think the word is operatives, who could live anywhere in the world. They would just live and have an ordinary life, except maybe one day they'd be called upon, or they may be asked to enter into a certain group, to join a certain church, or to shop at a certain bakery or something like that, to integrate themselves into the community and to kind of become the eyes and the ears within the community. And the paper said not to tell anyone about your job application. And a couple of times I had been tempted to apply, but then I discovered that you had to actually be a British national in order to apply. And because I was an Australian living in Britain, I didn't really qualify. I could have qualified in Australia, but by the time I returned back to Australia in 2016, I was over it. And I decided I wanted to do something else with my life. Well, Catherine responded to one of these ads, and it was for the Government Communications Headquarters, which is abbreviated with the letters GCHQ. Now, it's important to say Australia and Britain, neither of them have a First Amendment style of freedom in the same way that America does. What America has is it has its First Amendment clause that is very specific about this kind of unlimited free speech. I know that there are limitations, but they're very small limitations. Australia and Britain are pretty liberal in terms of the ability to speak, but there's no strict clause allowing that in their constitutions. But what Britain does have, which I'm very familiar with, is the Official Secrets Act of 1989. Now, the Official Secrets Act of 1989 is actually a replacement of the original one, which is the Official Secrets Act of 1911. When you sign the Official Secrets Act, it binds you for life. Now, the reason why I said that it was the Official Secrets Act of 1989 rather than the one of 1911 is that there was a change made in 1989. The original Secret Service Act of 1911 had the ability for a defendant who's seen to have breached the act to create a defense for themselves based on public interest, which means that if they have breached the Official Secrets Act and shared an official secret of some kind, they've done so in the public interest. Well, in 1989, they took that away. There was no longer any defense for having disclosed information to anybody for public interest because it was in the public's interest. And that's really important, an important part of the story. So Catherine signed the Official Secrets Act when she was hired by GCHQ. And in 2001, she started working. Her job was to translate any communications that came into the agency that were in Chinese, and she translated them from Chinese to English. It was shortly after 9/11, and the United States and Britain, so that's George W. Bush and Tony Blair were president and prime minister, respectively, of their countries. And the US and Britain were putting pressure on other United Nations countries to evade Iraq or to invade Iraq. It was Catherine's second year in the job. And she was at work one day and she read a memo by a fellow called Frank Koza, who was the Chief of Staff of Regional Targets Division at the National Security Agency in America. Frank Koza, in this memo, was wanting help from British intelligence in order so that the United States could plant bugs inside the delegate offices of other United Nations nations. And these nations were considered to be swing states. And so what the United States was concerned about was that these swing states, the 6 swing states, may vote against invading or attacking Iraq. The countries that were acting as swing states, where they could go either way, were Angola, Bulgaria, Cameroon, Chile, Guinea, and Pakistan. And they were all far lesser in power than the United States or Britain. And so to be able to bug their offices, their delegate offices, and use that information to be able to intimidate them or bully them into voting alongside America and Britain was pretty dodgy. So she was kind of outraged by the memo, because what the memo was saying is, we in the United States would like the British intelligence service to help us to bug these other nations so that we can find something on them that will help us to bully them into going on the side of the United States and Britain and agreeing to vote in favor of invading Iraq, even though we may not have a reason to do so, not a reason that we can justify. Catherine was upset when she saw this. Her conscience got to her. She printed the email out, which is an immediate breach of the Official Secrets Act, and she took it home. She took it home, and I think she just sat on it, not knowing really what she was going to do, but she knew she didn't like it. And so because she was uncomfortable, she wanted to have it in her possession so that she could think about what she was going to do with this memo. Now, Catherine had been reading books, and she read a book by a journalist by the name of Norman Solomon, who had written about the threats associated with invading Iraq. And what Catherine was concerned about was the ethical indiscretions of blackmailing nations about a war that might be bogus in nature. And Norman Solomon had been talking about how the invasion of Iraq, if it were to take place, because it was being debated a lot all over the world at the time, invading Iraq would be attacking a sovereign country for no good reason. That was the claim that was being made. Meanwhile, America and Britain were talking about how there's a risk of there being weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that Saddam Hussein was stockpiling these weapons. After being at home with this memo on the weekend and reading Norman Solomon's book, she decided it was her duty, in the greater interest of public safety and the safety of people around the world, to share this memo from Frank Koza to the British services, saying, look, we don't really have a leg to stand on here. We'd like to invade Iraq. There are 6 countries that are standing in the way that could vote either way. We need to find a way to kind of blackmail them or bully them or whatever it is. Can you help us bug their offices? Because we just need them to go our way. She sent that memo to the journalist Norman Solomon, whose book she'd read. And here's a quote from what he said when he got it. He said, I felt kinship, instant kinship, and actually what I describe as love for whoever had taken the enormous risk of revealing the NSA memo. Of course, at the time I was clueless about who'd done it. When he got it, he immediately recognized that this memo must have been sent by someone inside the intelligence services in Britain who was putting themselves at tremendous risk in order to make sure he could see it. The memo was published by a newspaper called the British Observer on the 2nd of March, 2003. The next day, on Monday, Catherine went to work. And when she got to work, she discovered that all hell had broken loose and an investigation was being started to find out where this leak had come from. 2 days later, Catherine, she buckled under the pressure and she confessed to her manager on the Wednesday. So she had remained a secret for 3 days. It only took her 3 days to confess that it was her. The arrest of Catherine took place immediately, and it was massive news all over the world on that 5th of March, 2003. If you do a search on the American newspapers for the 5th of March, 2003, or the 6th or the 7th, you'll find no news of it whatsoever, because every country of the world reported on it except for the United States. It was suppressed by every single major news forum, every single one, regardless of what your pet forum is, whether it's NBC or CNN or CBS or ABC or Fox News or any of them. They all suppressed it. None of the newspapers, none of the TV cable shows, none of the news forums, nowhere. The rest of the world, it was massive. Catherine Gunn was arrested for violation of the Official Secrets Act, that document that she had signed, which every single government employee working in security in any way or policing or anything like that would have to sign on their very first day of work. She spent the night in custody, and despite being arrested in March, she wasn't charged until late November. So they made her wait 9 months before they pressed charges against her. Meanwhile, the average American had absolutely no idea that any of this was taking place. There was ongoing debate taking place about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Weapons inspectors were sent in, but they didn't find anything. Iraq was invaded. Saddam Hussein was arrested. He was tried and he was executed. And Catherine, meanwhile, was waiting for her criminal trial to begin. Now, the news did ultimately begin to drip out, particularly when there were no weapons of mass destruction found. But a few people, who were more in the know than the average American, stepped forward to be able to give Catherine assistance in the United States and also in Britain. In the US, one of those people was the Reverend Jesse Jackson. There was also a former US government official who had leaked himself by the name of Daniel Ellsberg. He is the Pentagon Papers leaker from 1971. He stepped forward to help Catherine as well. And also there was a congressman by the name of Dennis Kucinich. Now, at the time, Dennis Kucinich was a Democrat. And he'd been in the 10th, he'd been congressman for the 10th District of Ohio, I think a couple of cycles. He then left Congress, and this year he's running as an independent to secure Ohio's 7th district, just something that I happened to find at the time. He also was a big advocate for Catherine as well. In Britain, so those were the American advocates. In Britain, the biggest advocate that Catherine had going for her advocacy was, it came from a woman by the name of Shami Chakrabarti. Now, Shami Chakrabarti she was a prominent human rights lawyer and activist. She's actually, at the time, she had been newly appointed to be the director of the National Council for Civil Liberties, which goes by the name Liberty. She was in that role until 2016, and Liberty is an activist organization that looks for human rights violations and opportunities for protection around the world, but primarily in the European Union and Britain as well, because that's the area of remit that they have. And to be appointed director of Liberty is a pretty big deal. So she was a very prominent human rights activist and, of course, a lawyer. She was in that job until 2016, which happened to be the same year that I returned to Australia from Britain. Since then, she actually has been voted in as a member of Parliament in Britain. She's registered to the Labour Party, which is similar to or equivalent, the British equivalent to the Democrats. Shami Chakrabarti was one of Catherine's legal advisors in her case, representing her on behalf of Liberty. I have met Shami Chakrabarti a number of times, actually, when I was working on the public order guidance. And so that would give you an indication of where the crossover is. Public order is all about the police use of force and the lawful infringement on civil rights, on a person's civil liberties. And so if a police officer is going to put handcuffs on you or search you or touch your person or ask you to remove an item of clothing so that they can inspect whether you're carrying evidence of a crime or something like that, or terrorism, object of terrorism or something like that, then they're going to be infringing on your rights, but doing it lawfully. And that's where we have to kind of see, it's like you have to slice hairs in order to find out legally what's lawful and what is an infringement of your rights and things like that. And so having someone like Shami attend meetings and give her perspective as a human rights lawyer means that I was in her company quite a lot. I would say that her profile was much, much bigger than mine. So I was just the scribe who would be quietly sitting at the table, writing a lot of notes about what was taking place there. And so I doubt that she'd remember me at all, but I certainly do remember her. She was known to be an outstanding advocate for human rights and has been given many awards over the years, many special titles and honours, including from the Queen. And I believe she has multiple titles and honours from the Queen as well. When I left Britain in 2016, Shami Chakrabarti was considered to be a superstar champion for human rights. And despite being a politician now, I hope that she still is. Anywho, so that is the story of Catherine Gunn. Now, Catherine never really ended up going through a criminal process because what happened was, with the justice system, you can't just make an accusation and charge somebody. As the prosecuting force, you have to enter into discovery, which means there needs to be an exchange of information. Everyone has to be playing off the same document pile. So you have to share information in order to proceed with your case. And that's where this case fell down, is the government didn't want to share any information with the public, with the court, with the defendant, and so they couldn't proceed in their case and the charges were dropped ultimately. But this is kind of an example of an ordinary person who was at odds with another entity, and both of them could be measured against the concepts of virtue. One of them was arrested for a crime. The other was considered to be working in the greater good of the country or of the world. But was that the case, or was it potentially the opposite? So I've got a little bit more here to tell you. I've got a quote here from Catherine Gunn herself from an interview that she gave to the Institute for Public Accuracy, which actually I believe one of the founders of that is Norman Solomon, who was the journalist that she originally wrote to. She describes how she decided to leak the Frank Kozar memo. She says, I went to the local bookshop and I went into the political section. I found two books which had apparently been rushed into publication. One was by Norman Solomon and Reese Ehrlich, and it was called Target Iraq. And the other one was by Milan Ray. It was called War Plan Iraq. And I bought both of them and I read them cover to cover that weekend. And it basically convinced me that there was no real evidence for this war. So I think from that point onwards, I was very critical and scrutinizing everything that was being said in the media. And Catherine was right. There was no real reason for the war. We know that now. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein was no different to any other dictator. The US and the UK were not at risk at any time. George W. Bush, his motives were a little bit questionable. I mean, it's been suggested that there were actually strategic interests for the US and allies to invade Iraq, and that it wasn't really related to weapons of mass destruction or any kind of risk, and that it related more to reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East so that it would be more conducive to the strategies of some of those Western allies. The 2003 invasion of Iraq directly resulted in over 200,000 deaths and many, many more injuries, including deaths of Americans as well. Indirectly, though, that invasion of Iraq resulted in an estimated 650,000 deaths that were reported. And they're indirectly deaths because they're related to violence that's ongoing after the invasion, or a general sense of lawlessness when you're desperately trying to find a way to survive, or the degradation of infrastructure and the method that people are living in those kinds of environments have to resort to in order to continue to sustain themselves. And what exactly did the war solve? Did it solve anything? Did it make the world a better place in any way? These are things that we all have to kind of think about when we think about Catherine Gunn's story. It seems as though Catherine was right. There was no reason for the war. It didn't solve a problem and it didn't add anything positive, but it did result ultimately in about 650,000 deaths. Meanwhile, Catherine was charged with offences under the Official Secrets Act. She was facing 2 years prison. They had her lingering, waiting before they even charged her. She lost her job. Her husband, who is a Turkish Kurd, they're still married, from what I understand, who had legally migrated to the UK and married Catherine, was put at risk. In fact, the government made an attempt to deport him as punishment against Catherine. I think Liberty, the human rights activist group with Shami Chakrabarti, stopped that from happening. But they stopped it at the 11th hour. I think he was getting ready. He was actually at a detention center and they were getting ready to put him on a plane when they finally managed to turn that around. He hadn't done anything wrong. He just, by association, was punished as a result of being married to Catherine. Both Catherine and her husband lost their livelihoods. They were given reputations as traitors in Britain, and ultimately she was unemployable in Britain, and so she had to migrate to another country, and so she did. Her and her husband went to Turkey, which is where she lives right now. She lost everything that she had worked for her entire life. Catherine felt it was her duty to expose this information to the public, as she believes the stakes were too high and the cost to innocent lives was too great. She has stated that she has no regrets about her decision, and if she was in the position again, she would do it again. So a year later, the charges against Catherine were dropped. And the reason why they were dropped was because the government was not willing to enter into a document disclosure for the case to progress. So what they did, actually, knowing that they were never going to share any documents with anyone, is they just kept her hanging on and hanging on. They tried to deport her husband. They made her unemployable, and they left her in limbo for a year. And the reason why they did that is because disclosing the documents would demonstrate that the government had lied to its people and that there was no basis for the invasion of Iraq. Let's have a look quickly and remind ourselves of what those human virtues are. There are 7 of them. Be courageous, exercise self-control, learn from your experiences, be equitable towards others, set the example, embody those virtues. Faith in God is not enough, and this is God's natural law. This is an example where I wonder where you fall on the spectrum. Who do you believe was the one that demonstrated virtue in this story? Was it Catherine? Was it the government? Was it the media? And what does that say about us here on Earth, humanity? My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. Also, I'm on TikTok, Threads, Facebook. Just put in a Google search for Ellie Dreams Down Under and you'll find me. Thank you to everyone who's watching today on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you want to be a member of the KGRA viewing family, don't forget to mention Ellie to get in the promo code section to get 30% off your subscription. Just go to live.kgradb.com to be able to get started. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.